comrades, I'm Red Princess. I've got a question for you. Have you ever thought about what the hell means Soviet Russia? Why not Socialistic Russia, Communistic Russia, Red Russia? Why Soviet?
Russian? Soviet.
This phrase is used in a popular meme, where Soviet Russia is a symbol of dictatorship, lack of democracy, any kind of privacy, practically all your worst nightmares, you name it. But what is Soviet? How can you have an attitude towards something you don't understand? In Russian language we would call it zhupil. Zhupil is a word meaning of which you don't understand, but for some reason believe it to be something bad or even scary. And this fear goes without saying. Anybody you ask will say that that is something bad, but nobody will tell you what the hell it is. Well, you know, like GM products. Soviet is a Russian word Soviet, which in this case means a democratic institution created during 3 Russian revolutions. Yeah, we had 3 revolutions. I bet you didn't know about it. Sovieti is an alternative to the classic parliament. There are some main differences. First of all, Sovieti was a multi-level system, built from the bottom up. At first, people elected their direct representatives of their factories and the settlements. Then this little Sovieti elected Sovieti of towns and cities. The next step was election of Sovieti of districts. After that, Sovieti of districts elected Sovieti of regions. And finally, on the National Congress of Sovieti, they elected the Central Soviet Government, ЦИК. And in theory, your candidate, you've elected yourself, you know yourself and you trust, could become a part of the government, and if he was good enough for that. Do you know anybody from your current government? I don't think so. Moreover, unlike in the parliament, Soviet deputies could be called back any time. Meanwhile, in bourgeois democratic regimes, we vote for the candidates we know nothing about and we have to trust their promises, and after the elections they forget about us for the next 4 years. In Soviet system, deputies could be called back any time, so they had to keep words. Secondly, elections to Sovieti did not require big funding, so deputies in Soviet system were not representatives of their rich sponsors. They were much more independent. And surely in this case, lobby was not possible at all. History of Russian Soviet originates in time of the revolution 1905-07. In Russian history, it was the first time when strikes of factory workers became so massive and spread all over the country. The very first Soviet was created in Ivanovo-Voznесенsk, one of the industrial hubs of Russian Empire. Factory workers of different factories collaborated with each other, so lockouts didn't work, and factory owners had to agree to negotiations. Factory workers elected 151 deputies, including 25 women, to represent their interests in negotiations. They called it Soviet of Labor Deputies. And technically that was some sort of trade union. As soon as factory owners upheld their claims, the first Soviet was abolished. First Russian Revolution was quelled through bloodshed. The following years were the time of erection and repressions, but still it had very positive consequences. First of all, after the First Russian Revolution, in Russia was legalized opposition. Secondly, scared by rebellion of common people, Tsar Nikolai II was forced to create State Duma, the parliament. How much important was it for Russia? Well, our Tsars used to be very conservative. The funny thing is that the most democratic institution was created in 16th century by, can you guess who?
Chosen by God confessor of all the Russians, defender of the one true faith and scourge of non-believers, Ivan the Terrible.
Well, actually, in Russian language, he is not the Terrible. In Russia, he is Grozny, Ivan Grozny. Grozny, it's like, you know, when you break windows in school, and your teachers call your father, and when he comes to talk to you, your father is Grozny. And you know that he is right. Among many great things Ivan Grozny did for our country was creation of Zemsky Sabor, some sort of Russian edition of the parliament. And unlike the first European parliaments, Zemsky Sabor consisted of representatives of all the estates of Russian society, not just richest people. After the last Ivan's son Fyodor died, in Russia happened a nasty crisis, which caused so-called the time of troubles. Well, you know, the slightest troubles, like the threat for a country to be erased from the map of Europe completely. Nothing serious. In the end of the time of troubles, Zemsky Sabor elected the new dynasty, Romanovy. But the very second Romanov, Alexei Mikhailovich, abolished Zemsky Sabor in the end of 17th century.
Так он, лукавый, презлым заплатил за предобрейшее. Сам захотел царствовать и всем владеть. Повинен смерти.
But already his son, Peter the Great, created the governing Senate. Unfortunately, the Senate did not have as much authority as Zemsky Sabor, but Zemsky Sabor remained in Russia as Zemstva, which was a self-government. After the Great French Revolution, you know all that decapitation of monarch stuff, Russian elite and Russian czars became very conservative and anti-democratic. After Napoleonic Wars, Russian Tsar Alexander I, the Tsar Tsar who defeated Napoleon, proclaimed that Russia will fight revolution all over the Europe. In time of the very next Tsar, Nikolai I, Russia was called Police Officer of Europe for its anti-revolutionary policy. For example, Russian troops suppressed revolution in Hungary. Sorry, Hungarians, really. And it's one of the reasons why Karl Marx hated Russian monarchy so much. And the most conservative and anti-democratic monarchs in Russia were the last two Tsars, Alexander III and Nikolai II, probably because their father and grandfather Alexander II was exploded by terrorists after his death. They broke up with his liberal policy, well, more or less liberal policy, and their reign was what you'd call totalitarian. Censorship in press, prohibition of different books, limiting of access to education, and so on. And what's the most important, they counted on the most totalitarian institution ever created in the history of human race, the Church. Well, let's be honest, the Church is the only institution which ever tried to literally control people's minds via confession. In Russian Empire, as the Church was technically the Ministry of Truth and Propaganda, you know, Peter the Great, he abolished the Patriarch. It's like an Orthodox Pope. And the monarch became a head of the Church. And it totally depended on the government. In the time of Nikolai, Church provided some sort of social service via confession and gave away all the necessary information to intelligence wise. Moreover, Nikolai was very religious and he believed that monarchy was God-blessed, while the parliament and democracy were against God's will. So no surprise that he dismissed almost every single convocation of State Duma, as almost each time it was more or less independent, it became too socialistic. Two other revolutions happened in the middle of the First World War in 1917. The Russian Empire till its very end was a half-feudal country. Its conservative economic and political system could not solve the most vital social issues like democratization, industrialization and development of agriculture. As a result, First World War exhausted Russian economic system. Financial system of Russia could not afford such a long war. So practically Russian army was supplied and financed by allies, and finally Russia got buried in debts. Moreover, the railroad system in Russia failed to supply the front with food and armory, which caused a very high rate of military casualties. Meanwhile, common people barely had something to eat. Russian bourgeoisie pampered demonstratively. Whereas the entire country was going down, they made up money by driving up prices for military supplies. And like it wasn't enough, Prime Minister of Russian Empire declared that the main aim of war for Russian Empire was annexation of Constantinople, Dardanelles and Bosphorus. Whereas the original appeal to the nation in the beginning of the war was very patriotic, it was claimed to be the fight for protecting Serbia, and people refused to fight for such a new cause. And in a short time, about 1 million of soldiers, who were mainly common people, deserted the front line. Russian army was falling apart. The Eastern Front was falling apart and the entire country was falling apart. Different social groups and political organizations, which were formed right after the First Revolution, learned different lessons from the current situation. Common people mistrusted monarchy and rejected the entire first class. Liberals got totally disappointed in monarchy and decided to get rid of it. Monarchists put all the blame on Nikolai himself. They believed that as soon as they replace him by some other Romanov, situation will improve in whisper. Anti-Tsar propagandists like to say that evil Bolsheviks overthrew Nikolai and imposed their dictatorship over Russia. Well, this is not true. Socialists, any socialists, including Bolsheviks, had nothing to do with dismissing the monarchy in Russia. The story was much more complicated. As the situation in the country was explosive, anything can trigger the collapse. In February 1917, it was drastic reduce of food supplies in Petrograd, in the capital, the modern St. Petersburg. Along with that, Putilsky factory administration declared lockout caused by shortage of necessary resources. 35,000 workers lost their jobs. This event fueled the massive demonstrations. The government was totally on the side of the factory owners. Tsar entrusted the army to quell the protests, but it didn't work out as the soldiers. They were originally common people, and they refused to shoot their mates. 26th of February, Nikolai dismissed the State Duma for the last time, but the deputies refused to obey. Instead, they created a provisional government. And on the 2nd of March, Nikolai was forced to abdicate by his uncle Nikolai Nikolaevich, the general of his army Rусский, and the ex-head of State Duma Guchkov, and both Guchkov and Rусский considered murder of Nikolai if he refused to abdicate. And no socialists had anything to do with it. Lenin was not even in Russia yet. February Revolution was a classic bourgeois revolution. Just a half of a year later, in Russia happened the Great October Socialistic Revolution. In such a short time, Russian bourgeoisie completely lost its power over the masses. And 25th of October, the provisional government was arrested by Lenin's authority. By the time of February 1917, Bolsheviks were the least multiple party in the country. And half of a year later, they became the leading party in the country. And several years later, after the Civil War, they created the state, the Soviet Union, for the next 72 years. How did that work out? There are many theories about it. First of them, Lenin was German's spy.
That accusation was proved by so-called system documents, a fake created by a Polish writer and journalist Ossendowski. Their authenticity was questioned from the very beginning, and all foreign ambassadors refused to acknowledge them officially. System documents became very popular among Russian immigrants after socialistic revolution. In 1956, an American historian, George F. Kennan, demonstrated that they were forgeries, and let alone that in time of the Civil War, German interventionists created conspiracies in Petrograd against Bolsheviks and supported some of white leaders in order to fight against the Red Army.
Another theory is that Lenin was a British spy.
UK needed Russia to keep fighting in the First World War, as they were not able to defeat Germany without their allies. Eastern Front was destructing tangible part of German forces, and Lenin was one of the few politicians in Russia and the only party leader who claimed for peace with Germany. His quote about it is frequently used by different anti-Soviet propagandists as a proof that evil Bolsheviks waged the civil war in Russia. Lenin literally said, "Let's turn imperialist war into civil one." And what did that mean if to make an Marxistisch to English interpretation? Let's turn the war of proles against other proles for the interests of capitalists into the war of proles of all the countries involved against their own bourgeois governments. The First World War was a colonial war in which millions of people from all over Europe paid their lives so the bourgeoisie could exploit particular territories around the world. German bourgeoisie wanted to get some colonies, and town bourgeoisie wanted to keep their colonies under their control. 11 million lives were paid for that. It was a disaster, but there was no evil German's will in that. It was just a result of capitalistic globalization. It was just the beginning of imperialistic phase of capitalism. And Lenin even had to confront with some of his party members, trying to convince them that immediate peace with Germany was necessary for Russia. Meanwhile, the provisional government was 100% on the side of Entente. And who is the spy here? Definitely Lenin. UK ended up supplying underground anti-Bolshevik organizations and, was the most important, the ambassador, Sir Robert Hamilton Bruce Lockhart, was arrested by predecessor of KGB, VCK, for using diplomatic channels and British Red Cross in order to supply white armies. So, how did the Bolsheviks beat up all their opponents?
Opponents, namely Kadety and Октябристы, bourgeois parties, Черносотенцы, Russian nationalists and anti-Semites, Mensheviki, эсеры, leftists and righties, socialists. Democratic way.
First of all, the very name of the party, Bolsheviki, what does it mean? They began as Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1898, but on the very second Congress in 1903, it split in two parts. The minority, followed one of the leaders, Martov, minority, меньшинство, меньшевики, and the majority followed Lenin, majority, большинство, большевики. By that, Lenin was democratically supported by a greater amount of the party members from the beginning. The next thing is that after the February Revolution, in Russia were created two governments.
The first one, provisional government, and the second one, in the parallel, socialistic, the government of Soviet. Socialists referred to the experience of Ivanovo-Voznесенsk. At this time, they decided to use Soviet as a political platform. Once again, factory workers, and this time factory workers of Petrograd, elected their deputies to represent their interests. Then the soldiers joined them, and finally peasants elected their deputies too. And together they formed Soviet of Petrograd. Later, Soviets were created in many other regions of Russia, and that was not authorized by Lenin. That was an actual democratic movement. Why these three social groups, factory workers, soldiers, and peasants? Well, in Russian Empire we didn't have the mass educational system, and most of common people couldn't even read and write at all. And factory workers among common people were the most educated people because they had to work with pretty complicated machines. Also, factories as a place where thousands of people worked together all the time was a good place for socialist propaganda. Peasants, and yeah, exactly peasants, not farmers. In Russian Empire we had actual feudal peasants. They wanted so-called black repartition. The point is that in spite of the huge size of our country, we don't have really much fertile lands, and most of the lands we've got are placed in very hard climate. So that was one of the reasons why there was not enough land for all the peasant families. Another reason was that 60% of all fertile lands belongs to feudal landlords, and peasants didn't want to put up with it. Since the abolition of serfdom in Russia in 1861, they wanted the black repartition. Russian peasants believed that lands could not be in private property. You know, there is a popular belief that Russians used to be communists before the revolution, before Karl Marx was even born. And finally, soldiers, because they were victims of so-called system of real. That means that common people and noble people in Russian Empire had different status and they had different set of rights. And in the army this discrimination was the most obvious, as officers were mostly noble people and soldiers they were originally peasants. Russian Empire was, you know, like America in 50s, but instead of racial segregation we had social segregation. This discrimination was the reason of the violence by soldiers against the officers in time of the February Revolution. In first days, they murdered hundreds of officers. Unlike the provisional government, Soviets were democratically elected, had real power, were supported by masses, and what's most important, they solved the most vital problems. For Petrograd those days, it was food. Unlike the provisional government, Soviets were not acknowledged by foreign governments. Foreign ambassadors preferred to contact only provisional government.
And exactly the Soviet government was the very way Bolsheviks came to power. The provisional government was hesitating. Social democrats of all the kinds hoped to unite their efforts with bourgeois parties and to find a consensus on the future actions. And their hesitation delayed resolution of the most vital problems in the country, which were aggravated by the First World War. It led to so-called July Days, when soldiers and factory workers flooded the streets of Petrograd, claiming to dismiss the provisional government and to pass its authority to Soviets. The protesters were fired on, but Soviet leaders hesitated to take the full power. They lost their chance to overthrow the provisional government. And what about Bolsheviks? Well, I need to clear something out first.
Lenin could not command his party like generals command his army. Meanwhile, bourgeois parties, bourgeois parliament parties are, like ant colonies. They all together vote for decisions of their leaders. If you disagree with decisions of your party, you better just leave. You are no use in the parliament for your party. Bolsheviks' party were not like this. Lenin had to try very, very hard to convince his own party to follow his instructions.
As an example, after the July days, the majority of Bolsheviks doubted that there was another chance to dismiss the provisional government via a coup. Meanwhile, Lenin was confident that no governments ever give away their power for free will, and he insisted on a coup to be inevitable. This contradiction led to a conflict in the Bolshevik party. Lenin could not manage to convince his party to follow his instructions. As a result, 20th of October, two moderate Bolsheviks, Zinoviev and Kamenev, published the letter criticizing a coup in open sources, and by that gave away the plans of the party. Lenin claimed to expel both of them, but Bolshevik's Central Committee refused to. After that, party members were forbidden to express their own opinions in behalf of the party. Why was Lenin so insistent on the coup? Maybe because he wanted to impose his own dictatorship upon Russia? Well, that was barely possible, as the real power in the capital those days was in the hands of revolutionary masses, and anybody who tried to go against their will would get killed. The actual reason was that the provisional government planned to prevent another armed rebellion of people. It ordered to send two-thirds of Petrograd garrison, which was on the side of socialists, to the front. Also, it initiated evacuation of governmental institutions and properties. That made Bolsheviks believe that bourgeoisie wanted to leave Petrograd for Germans and let them quell the revolution. When Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, left Petrograd 24th October to bring loyal troops, that made Lenin even more confident that the provisional government needed to be arrested. Finally, 25th of October, Lenin initiated the actual first Spetsnaz operation ever. Ex-general of Tsar's army Sveshnikov was in charge. In a short time, loyal marines and soldiers blockaded all the telegraphs and railroad stations in the city. Plus, they occupied military schools which were loyal to the government. In 2 a.m., the provisional government was arrested. Bolsheviks and right esseres did not support the coup and left Soviets, but they were not a majority of Soviet government, so the Second Congress of Soviets enacted their first decrees. It was just the beginning of a long deadly struggle of different political powers and economic interests of different countries on the territory of Russia. Bolsheviks all alone had to withstand the impact of 14 countries which sent their troops in different regions of our country, and white armies supported by those interventionists. All in all, among all the political powers in Russia, only Bolsheviks did not collaborate with any foreign powers, unless you count as a foreign power a democratic movement of European socialists who refused to fight against the very first people democracy in the history of human race. It is noteworthy that the most significant white leaders and other white immigrants massively supported Hitler in time of the Second World War and joined Nazis' army, which came on the territory of USSR to genocide Soviet people. And they took a huge part in fueling Nazis' anti-Soviet propaganda. Till these days, myths and lies they spread serving interventionists and Hitler are believed to be the truth about socialism in general and USSR in particular.
Unfortunately, Soviet system was destroyed in Russia. While democracy is good only for peaceful times, it doesn't work in a country which is sieged like a fortress. And in Russia's case, there were just 19 peaceful years between the end of Civil War and Second World War, very hard peaceful times. And then, just a year after the Second World War, our ex-allies declared a Cold War upon our country, and Cold War is not the best time for democracy too, actually. But still, the lesson should be learned because Soviet system is an alternative for the parliament. There is a new term in social studies, political absenteeism, which means that people refuse to go to the elections. Social studies claim that this is immature from people to refuse going to elections. Well, because elections are a way of legitimization of bourgeois authority. And when people get disappointed with institution, they lose the hope because they don't know if there are any other ways. It's believed that there are no other ways. There are just two kinds of democracy is believed. Direct democracy, like in ancient Greece, which is definitely impossible in modern society, and democracy with representatives. In Marxist social studies, there are two kinds of the democracy: bourgeois democracy and people democracy.
Bourgeois democracy means that once in several years, people are allowed to pick one of the candidates offered by the ruling class to implement the connection between them and the ruling class. In theory, people can offer their own candidate, but there is a barrier. Any candidate needs a lot of money for his election campaign. So, after applying all the party assortment available, people lose interest in politics, and then bourgeois media makes political ignorance a trend. People hate knowing anything about politics and economics, and they don't realize how much their lives depend on it. Bourgeoisie wants us to keep on playing their game and to keep on legitimizing their power via elections ritual. But it doesn't want us to create the alternative parties or any other organizations which would offer different ways to go for our society, as some of these ways could exclude any need in bourgeoisie itself. That's why bourgeois propaganda tries so hard to replace any piece of information about socialism, Marxism, USSR, and so on by cliches, memes, zhupili, and gags to erase from people's heads the very idea of the alternative. As Lenin said, study, study, and once again study. Or maybe he said, learn, learn, and once again learn. Or we better do both. If you don't want to live an illusion, you better double check what public opinion tells you about things. You can even double check this video and write in comments if I were wrong.